Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. My name is Katie Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. If you have not heard of the League before, but have made your way to this webinar, let me introduce who we are. We're New York statewide nonprofit focused on investing in people and projects that champion the essential role of preservation in community revitalization, sustainable economic growth, and the protection of our historic buildings and landscapes. We do this lots of different ways in all corners of New York State. We have technical services, grants, including our signature grant programs, Preserve New York and technical assistance grants through the New York State Council on the Arts, our 7 to Save list of endangered historic sites. We do public policy and advocacy work on the local, state, and federal levels. We have our Excellence in Historic Preservation Awards, and we have a whole slate of online programming like this one. And before we get into it too far, I do want to let you know that if you need or want closed captioning, live transcription is available. It is turned on for this program, so you can just toggle in your toolbar and turn those captions on if you would like. So today we're going to be talking about deconstruction. And I think this is a really sticky topic for preservationists, in part because, we want to save the buildings. We don't want buildings to come down. But in terms of real sustainability, tackling climate change, and being part of the conversation, not every building will be saved. Some buildings are going to come down, and I think that it's important to note that preservationists don't have to take themselves out of the situation once a building is coming down. Deconstruction can take those heritage building materials and put them back into active use, even if the building they came from no longer exists. And so we want to talk about the role that preservation can play in deconstruction, how deconstruction can help a sustainable and just world for all of us, and especially as we think about climate action and how preservation can really be a part of tackling climate change. This needs to be part of that conversation as well. And so we're really excited about the panel that we've put together today. We are joined by our colleagues at Historic Ithaca, who graciously agreed to co-present this with us, so thank you to them. Christine O'Malley is going to be moderating the conversation for us today. Christine leads Historic Ithaca's efforts in education, advocacy, and community engagement, and consults with property owners, businesses, government officials, and educators. She is part of the Crowd Working Group, the Circularity, Reuse, and Zero Waste Development Working Group, and she participates in their efforts to promote salvage and sustainability in our communities. After Christine gives a brief intro for the topic, we're going to hear from our panelists. First up is May Bowley. She's the Executive Director of Repurposed Savannah, a nonprofit dedicated to saving and sharing historic buildings at the end of their life cycle. Repurposed Savannah works to replace short-sighted demolition practices with sustainable deconstruction, historic research and documentation of sites, and training for women in the male-dominated construction industry. After May, we'll hear from Natalie Henshaw. She joined Preservation Maryland in 2021 and directs the campaign for historic trades, overseeing apprenticeships, curriculum development, and partnerships. She has done hands-on preservation work with various nonprofits, construction companies, and federal agencies. In 2016, she founded a preservation company in Savannah, Georgia, specializing in window restoration and historic masonry. And then last up, we have Stephanie Phillips. She is a senior public policy and planning professional working at the intersection of heritage conservation and sustainability. She leads the City of San Antonio's Deconstruction program, which aims to maximize material salvage and reuse opportunities from older structures while advancing the city's climate action, affordable housing, and workforce development goals, all through a heritage conservation lens. So I think this is a really great group of folks to talk about this topic today. And I want to let you know that if you can't stay for the whole thing, this webinar is being recorded, so you can find it later on our Facebook page, on our YouTube channel. If you have questions during anyone's presentation, please drop them in the Q&A box. The chat will remain open for general comments. I will try to drop some links there if people mention anything that I can find really quickly to reference. But if you have questions for anyone, please do drop them in the Q&A box. Each of our panelists have about 10 minutes for their individual presentations, and then they're all going to come together at the end for a group discussion. So I think it'll be a really good one, and we would appreciate any questions that you all might have too. And I do want to thank our sponsors for this program. The Future of Preservation webinar series is sponsored by the Peggy Ann and Roger G. Gary Charitable Trust, so thank you to them. And thanks again to Historic Ithaca for being part of this with us. And with that, I am going to hand it off to Christine, who is going to give us a better, broader introduction for the topic of deconstruction, and then she'll hand it over to our panelists. So thanks, Christine.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome everybody. Hello, greetings from Ithaca, New York. We're coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Guyanacona people, and they are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So, as part of our programming here at Historic Ithaca, we have a reuse and salvage shop called Significant Elements. It's been in business for over 30 years. Historic Ithaca, as Katie mentioned, is also a founding partner of PROUD, the Circularity, Reuse, and Zero Waste Development Working Group. And I'll briefly explain our origins and our work in a moment. So our subject today, just trying to get forward. Here we go. Okay, so our subject today, deconstruction, salvage, and sustainability. They're very relevant and urgent, as we all know, given our global climate crisis. In the US alone, waste produced by construction and demolition amounts to roughly 600 million tons annually. And as you can see from the bar graphs here, that's an enormous portion of our total waste streams, and far more than municipal waste. All of the embodied carbon generated to make the material, transport it, and install it in a building is wasted in the demolition process. The quality of the building material, the craftsmanship, the artistry of the various components are also lost. And as a community, we are deprived of our built heritage and history through demolition. So in early 2020, we began meeting collaboratively with a group of interested partners in Ithaca and the surrounding area to explore this issue. As preservationists, our priority is always preserving buildings or advocating for their adaptive reuse. But what is our possible role when a building cannot be saved despite our very best efforts? What can we do for a building when it's going to be replaced? That was a stark reality facing us in the summer of 2020 when the Chicona block that you see on your screen here, a 1912 commercial building in Collegetown near Cornell University, was scheduled for demolition. Although we engaged in a long campaign with many community members to have this building locally designated and saved, the local designation was voted down by our Common Council, and the owners proceeded with their plans to redevelop the site. We were able to arrange for some salvage work to take place at the building in a short time, but to our great disappointment, the building was rapidly demolished in the summer of 2020. Out of this frustrating experience, our group of interested partners came together to form CROWD. And on the slide, you can see some of the founding, or all of the founding partners, various organizations and individuals from Ithaca and the Finger Lakes region of New York State, with expertise in architecture, planning, preservation, salvage, and reuse. Our focus on buildings and waste concentrates on issues of sustainability and reuse. And we have really been focusing on promoting deconstruction when preservation is not possible. We're looking at other cities for examples, and we're currently creating a draft deconstruction ordinance that we hope to present to the city of Ithaca. We meet regularly and we work collaboratively on policy and engagement. And recently we launched our website, and I hope that you'll visit it and take a look. There's a natural connection here, we believe, with the spectrum of methods used by preservationists. Conserving building materials saves embodied carbon. Preservation extends the lifespan of whole buildings and retains our built heritage. We can see that in the preservation of whole buildings like the Cascadilla Boathouse on the top left of your screen, or moving whole buildings like this local Greek Revival house, the Yellow House in the middle. The conservation of building materials also happens when buildings are retained for overbuilds, like Ithaca's Carey building on the top right, or parts of buildings that are retained in situ, as you can see in the partial reuse of a late 19th century foundry building for the new ironworks apartments here in Ithaca. But when preservation is not possible, after all efforts have been exhausted to save a building, salvage and deconstruction have important roles to play. Deconstruction is careful, and it's a systematic dismantling of a building structure to maximize the recovery of valuable materials and architectural components for reuse, resale, and recycling. It's the environmentally friendly alternative to demolition. And in this diagram, used by one of our CROWD partners, Felix Heisel of the Cornell University Circular Construction Lab, preservation and deconstruction can be seen as contributing to a circular economy. Instead of take, make, throw away that we see in our linear economy, the circular economy focuses on take, make, and repeat. Crowd's work is part of a growing movement, as you'll hear from our speakers today, to promote deconstruction and shift away from the wasteful practice of demolition to support circular economy and also to develop a green workforce. And for us in Ithaca, we see our work as being an important component of Ithaca's Green New Deal efforts and the equitable transition to carbon neutrality by 2030. If you're in Ithaca over the next few weeks, I encourage you to stop by and see our Deconstructing Demolition exhibition in the atrium of the Tompkins Center for History and Culture downtown. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to May.
Hi, everyone. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen. Should bear with me. Oops. Here we go. All right. Everybody can hear me? My name is May. I'm the Executive Director of Repurposed Savannah, as I mentioned before. Thank you guys so much for that great introduction. Really excited to be here today talking with you all. Preservationists are my favorite people to speak to because I do believe we are set up in the best possible way to have a huge impact on this issue. And it's a great marriage. Deconstruction and preservation. So what is deconstruction? Let's start there. That's a pretty important topic. Deconstruction is the systematic unbuilding of a building, usually in relatively the rough, opposite order of how it was built, with the goal of retaining as much material as possible for reuse and landfilling as little as possible. There are three types of decon I want to cover that really sort of like cover the range of what we do. Non-structural is probably what you're most familiar with. So this is architectural salvage. It's going in and pulling out the windows, the mantles, and the gorgeous details, corbels, whatever is on the surface of a building, the finish, if you will. And then we have structurally compromising decon. This is, I think, what a lot of people think of. I like to refer to people who do this work as the poachers of our industry. They're going in usually without permission. They're rating a building for its material value, which often compromises its structure, and then the building often has to be torn down as a result. This is what happens when we don't get out in front of what to do with buildings at the end of their life cycle. Obviously, we love to preserve them in place, but when we leave them in vulnerable conditions, they're vulnerable and they can be damaged, and that can often result in their loss. And then there's what we do, which is structural removal. It's a full service option to get you that empty lot that you need for whatever reason without putting your building in the landfill. So something I really do need to emphasize is decon is an alternative to demolition. It is not an alternative to preservation. But this is important because, as was just mentioned, we have to talk about the fact of structural loss and preservation. I look forward to the day when every historic building is saved in place. On that day, I always say I will hang up my crowbar and move on and work on something else. But until that happens, we have work to do. And there's a lot of reasons outside of just the fact of structural loss why it's a benefit for preservation to get involved in the deconstruction movement. First and foremost, the need for in-kind materials. Heritage materials are finite and irreplaceable. We're in the middle of an environmental crisis. There are public health concerns with demolition, and demolition, especially when it's not attached to any kind of documentation or research, is tantamount to the erasure of local history. We're going to go through a lot of this pretty quickly because we got a lot of great speakers here today. And I want to just maybe echo a little bit of what was just mentioned about the volume of construction and demolition waste. So it's more than twice as much as municipal solid waste in this country. If we put all the garbage from every city and town in a pile, it wouldn't be half the size of the construction and demolition pile. So we got to really address this issue. This is a real intangible concern. The average American house is roughly the same amount of tonnage as an American generates in garbage in their entire lifetime. So every house we keep out of the landfill, we've offset an entire American. We feel pretty proud about that. Everyone on our team has been absolved for life. Just kidding. And then on a global scale, the European Commission just released a study suggesting that the construction and demolition industry is responsible for creating in total a third of the world's waste, and that's far too much. How did we get here? I love to discuss with preservationists the history of deconstruction. So demolition is actually a newfangled invention. Demolition as we know it didn't hit the scene until World War II. It was the development of earth-moving machines designed to help create logistical ease in the European theater, to create pathways for tanks and troops to move through space, to clear rubble after bombing out cities. This technology was brought home after World War II and was put to use for such projects as you were going to be familiar with, such as urban renewal. The bulldozer came to North America, and we saw clearance of the domestic built environment on an unprecedented scale anywhere in the history of the human species. Today, we are seeing levels that are surpassing those levels for the first time ever in history. So what did we do before that? I mean, what happened in the past? Believe it or not, buildings historically were deconstructed. When they reached the end of their life cycle, traditional practice, the only thing that made sense back then was to take the building apart by hand and to reuse those materials. This might seem like a cutting edge, progressive, maybe even, like you said, sticky issue for preservationists, but it's actually not. It's a very healthy and natural part of the breathing of the built environment. And it certainly is got a lot more, it's got a lot more historical backing than abandoning buildings to demolition when we can't save them. So I highly recommend this article written by my dear friend, Allison Arlotta, which will go specifically into the deconstruction that was going on in New York City around the turn of the century. I deconstruct buildings every day. This is what I do for a living. I do it because I love them. I do it because I love what they're made out of. And I see evidence of building material reuse in almost every project that I work on. I'll show you some examples here in the workers' cottage. It's very clear where boards which were previously painted have been used to clad a roof. You can see even the rafter tail sticking out with its little bit of blue paint on the end. No one would have gone into this ceiling and just painted a few boards specifically. Like, that's reuse. Here's some crates, outboard motor crates from Illinois that we found in the Mercer Cottage, which is where George's son, Johnny Mercer, famous for the song Moon River, he grew up in this house. So it was a real honor to take it apart when it couldn't be saved. Anyways, outboard motor crates from Illinois with this gorgeous embossed logo. That just made my day. We find brick all the time that's significantly older than the building that it's found in. These bricks have fingerprints in them, they're legible. All handmade brick in the South was produced before the Civil War. This building wasn't built till 1915. So these bricks either had a former life or they sat around in a brickyard for a while, like over 50 years, and then were used in this building. But they certainly weren't made and bought new for this building. Here is a Victorian era stairwell we found inside of a 1940s bungalow. Somebody decided to convert the attic into a half-story upstairs. You can see the picture on the left. We got really excited because we started cracking the house open right there in the stairwell. And when I saw this beautiful historic lumber, I thought, oh my gosh, is this house way older than we thought? No, it was just the staircase. But there it is. That was definitely rescued from a former building and inserted. Here you can often paint is the best indicator to show where materials had a former expression. And you can often see the ghost marks where another piece of wood would have passed over that. And often you can even still see, in this case, there's still a nail in there. They didn't even pull it out before it got reused in 1950s garage. Here are, again, rafter tails in the attic of a roof. There was a lot of material in this house that had consistencies to it, like similar paint colors. Obviously, these were all from the same application. So we really do believe that there was a cottage on this house that was deconstructed. And because this is quite a remote location, they just kept the materials on site and reused them in the new builds. This would have been very common. Okay, here's that same house when all of the finish had been stripped off. And there you can see it plain as day. So material reuse is historic, is traditional. The skills that are associated with it are traditional trades. Something I'll let Natalie get into. We love to see deconstruction being included in preservation trades, because it should be. Preservation offers a great opportunity, deconstruction offers a great opportunity to research and document the building. We work with school groups on every job to make sure that they can come in and see the building before it's removed, that we're getting it down on paper, and that it's an opportunity to really engage with preservationists and to educate on the history of construction. We do document every project we work on. We go to great lengths. We research the history of the building and we attach that research to every sale. So when you buy a piece of lumber from this house, you get a link that goes straight to our website that will tell you all about the history of the house. And nowadays we're even going so far as to work with a local drone company to 3D scan these properties. All of this is made possible because we are attaching our preservation values to the effort to remove this building in a way that doesn't result in, the phrase I hate, a total loss. It's only a total loss if we tear it down and forget about it. Everybody knows that demolition creates a dust cloud that's unhealthy. Our research here in Savannah has shown that health concern is disproportionately affecting poor people and people of color. You can do this analysis. These are all public records. We pulled every demo permit that was issued within the city, and you can see the 72% lead paint indicator. Person of color population within 1/8 of a mile is 88%, and low income population within 1/8 of a mile is 84%. So demolition is disproportionately harming the most vulnerable people in our society, and we got to take a hard look at that. Also, when we're tearing down these buildings almost predominantly in African-American communities, whose histories are we erasing? So whenever we've had the opportunity to work with families, you know, in some cases, like in the case of my client, Mary Simmons, we discovered that it was her great-great-grandfather who purchased the land that her house was sitting on in 1882. That's an incredible history and something that we are super glad that didn't just vanish into thin air. Our supply is local. We have not struggled with supply chain issues in the same way that other lumber companies have. This is really speaking to the circular economy idea. We are not vulnerable to supply chain issues. Our lumber isn't coming from China. It is coming from houses that are right here. It is well suited to this climate. They're native species. And if anything, I can tell people with pride that we had a boom in materials during the pandemic. Obviously, as the industry sort of took off, where everybody was struggling to get their hands on materials, we had more than ever, and we didn't have to increase our prices a penny. If anything, the market rose to reach where we're at. So that was really exciting and something I highly recommend. I can't give a presentation about this without mentioning that it is really the meat in these buildings that is so special. I love all the frilly finish too, but the lumber that these buildings are built out of is also incredibly precious, and it's our heritage. So we cut down the primordial forest in order to build America. And many of the trees that we use are now endangered or extinct. For example, the American elm, the longleaf pine, my favorite tree, which was dominant in our region. So that's what I have the pleasure of handling every day. And then of course, the American chestnut, RIP. So, you know, throwing these things in the landfill is throwing away our heritage. It's also throwing away native heritage. This is not our forest. We cut it all down. And I think these trees will never see, those forests will never see the light of day again. We've cut them all down. They're gone. We'd all have to die and give the planet a few thousand years to recreate that old growth forest that we harvested. So it's really important that we're not throwing that heritage in the garbage. Here's a lovely, my wood pun. It's heart pine. This is the slide for you if you feel already convinced. We do a lot of work to try to tie preservation to policy and deconstruction together. We've started mapping out here in Savannah, along with many of our colleagues across the country, including Stephanie, who's presenting later, to try to create a path towards more policy support for circular building removal. And there's a lot of things you can do. I mean, anything from working with your local commissions to working directly with contractors to working with the city to working with the federal government. There's a lot we can do, and we need help, so sign up. So ultimately our goal, as I move on and get ready to hand this over, is to replace this with this and this. And I should mention before I move on that I think it was mentioned before, our company also specifically focuses on training women for careers in construction and demolition. We call this Femolition. Here's one of my crew driving a forklift. We have a really awesome crew. They're really amazing, hard workers. Everybody comes to us with a varying level of skill. So some have been working in historic buildings their entire lives, and others have never held a power tool before. It's awesome. All are welcome. Everybody works together to save history and to gain skills. We have a really good time. Really excited to share these other presenters with you. Natalie and Stephanie, both very good friends of mine. They have a lot of brilliant things to say. So thank you all for tuning in and looking forward to your questions. That's it for me.
All right. Hey, May, thank you. Good job. All right. So there we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Henshaw. As May mentioned, we're friends. We know each other well. I'm actually based in Savannah and work quite regularly with them in our window work. But I'm also working with Preservation Maryland as the director for the Campaign for Historic Trades. And I'll get into what we're doing with the campaign, what it's all about. And a lot of it's with workforce development. So explaining why that's even needed for the historic trades and how that intersects with what we're doing with deconstruction. So the Campaign for Historic Trades is a dynamic workforce development program to expand and strengthen careers in the historic trades. It's made possible through a partnership between Preservation Maryland and the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Training Center. Preservation Maryland was founded in 1931. It's a statewide organization and is dedicated to preserving Maryland's historic buildings, neighborhoods, landscapes, and archaeological sites through outreach funding, workforce development, and advocacy. And the Historic Preservation Training Center was founded in 1977 as a division of the National Park Service. Its focus is preservation training. So it provides services for the treatment of National Park Service federal and state historic properties through education and employee development and the skills and crafts required to preserve and maintain these important places. They host extensive training programs aimed in building the skills of personnel responsible for the maintenance and preservation of these historic properties, both the public and private sectors. So they have a base in Frederick, Maryland, but they work with the public, and they also work within the National Park Service to train up people in preservation trade skills. So because they're based in Frederick, Maryland, and obviously Preservation Maryland is in Maryland, and with our aligned goals, it was a natural partnership to enact the Campaign for Historic Trades. So here I want to actually describe what are the historic trades. We actually get that question a lot because it is potentially vague. You know, it could be basket weaving, but it could also be timber framing. So the way we define it are the skills needed to maintain, preserve, restore, rehabilitate, reconstruct, and deconstruct historic structures. For those familiar with preservation, I'm going to talk a little bit about it in case anybody in the audience is unfamiliar, but some of these treatments and these ideas come from what's called the Secretary of Interior Standards for Historic Preservation. Within them, they have guidelines for how to preserve, restore, rehabilitate, and reconstruct historic structures. What we would like to do is expand some of that to also include maintenance and deconstruction. So to maintain, it's the step before preservation, clean and upkeep the historic fabric and address issues before they create larger long-term consequences. When I worked in a preservation technician role, one of my main duties was pigeon patrol, which was cleaning up pigeon droppings. So that's not really preservation, but it is an important maintenance step because what happens if you don't clean that up is it can compromise the historic fabric. It can actually eat away at some of the materials. So it is not preservation, but it's an important step in preserving the historic fabric. So we want to include maintenance as part of this because it's preventative. Preservation means to repair existing historic materials and retain a property's form as it has evolved over time. That's what you see in most historic properties, just the general preservation of it, repainting, repointing masonry, replacing any type of rotten boards that come about. To restore means to depict a property at a particular period of time in its history while removing evidence of the other periods. Good example is Mount Vernon with George Washington. It is restored to the time period George Washington lived there. To rehabilitate means to alter or add to the historic property to meet continuing and changing uses while retaining the property's historic character. Think any brewery in a big city that used to be in some type of factory. It used to be a factory, now it's a brewery. It still has historic fabric, but its use changed, and so some of the design changed to meet that new use. To reconstruct means to create vanished or non-surviving portions of a property for interpretive purposes. Good example is Bent's Old Fort in Colorado. It is a reconstruction of an 1800s adobe fort. And that reconstruction is now almost historic. It's almost 50 years old. And to deconstruct, as May mentioned, we want to make the definition as it aligns with our preservation values. So this is why I think it's important to involve ourselves in this conversation. We want to say it's to research, to document, and to unbuild all or part of a structure to retain as much of the original material for reuse. And if you think about these other aspects of it, almost every layer involves some portion of deconstruction. To rehabilitate, you might have to deconstruct part of the building. To restore, you might have to deconstruct an addition that's not from that time period. Even to preserve, if you're taking out your window sashes for just general maintenance, you have to deconstruct part of the components to get to the window sash and then put it back in. You might not be removing in total, but the theory and the principles are still there for it. So that's why it's a natural part, and we want to start including it in this definition of historic trades. So to get to what we're doing with this, so what does it mean that we're talking about these historic trades? We have a dilemma with the workforce on this. We don't have a defined occupation in preservation or historic trades. And that's not to say people aren't working in it, but if you look at other occupations, we do not have the standardization across the board on what it means to be a preservation carpenter, to be a deconstruction technician. And so what we're working on is a cohesive plan to get that. Oh, pardon me. A cohesive plan to get to that point. A brief overview of the history. The National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966. This said that we had to preserve historic buildings on the federal lands to certain guidelines. But what they realized after passing that is that we don't have the trades workforce to meet that demand. This was the Whitehill Report. It was published in 1968 by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It outlined the problem and potential solutions to get there. Over the next few decades, a few different initiatives came about to try and resolve the issues that the Whitehill Report outlined. Different trades associations were found, different schools, and different training programs. You can read through the timeline here, but one that I do want to highlight actually is the Timber Framers Guild. It was formed in 1985, and in the last few years, they actually registered an apprenticeship in timber framing. It is one of the only ones that have been about related to the historic trades. And so the apprenticeships is what we are focusing on because it resolves a few of the different problems. An apprenticeship creates an occupation. This is an example of a carpenter apprenticeship. You can look this up online on ONET. You can find out about a carpenter. It has a job code, this 47-2031. Tells you the median wages, gives you a description of what a carpenter does. It also tells you how long you need for training, what's the instruction you need to become a carpenter, and what you can estimate you will earn, and also the projected labor needs for it in the future. You can find all this online in the Bureau of Labor Statistic, ONET, Rapids, apprenticeship.gov. So if somebody's interested in becoming a carpenter, there are these national level ways to go about doing it. You can find somebody in your area to go train with too to get to that point. We don't have this for the historic trades whatsoever. The Timber Framers Guild was unique because it did create a rough carpentry apprenticeship. And that was what they called it because they did framing with the timber framing. So by doing so, they created this occupational code and that you can track and use and have standardized training across the board, across the country. So they were able to define, this is what we want as our standard for timber framers. What we're doing at the campaign is working with other jobs of this ilk. And by registering with the Department of Labor, what they want is to work from an existing job backwards. So if we use a deconstruction technician as an idea, what does a deconstruction technician journey level worker have? What are their skills, knowledge, and abilities that make them journey level? How long does it take to get there? What do they need to know? What do they need to learn? And how much do they earn? So we're designing backwards from the existing jobs and creating a training plan to meet what we think those standards are. By doing so, we create those national standards, like I was saying. So what we want to do in the next year, by 2023, we are focusing on a preservation technician, preservation carpentry, historic glazing, historic roofing, and deconstruction. A quick overview of the apprenticeship and what it looks like. This is on the left side, a work processes schedule. It gives you a description. It has our job codes at the top, tells you how long it takes to get to this journey level of it. And it has competencies listed down here. So you have their different competencies listed with approximate hours to get there. On the subsequent pages, there's more that add up to the total number of hours, but then also a section for what they call related instruction. What do you need to go and learn about? Do you need to go to an OSHA 30 class? Do you need to go to an electrical class? So the sponsor of this apprenticeship helps define what does it take to become, in this case, a maintenance repairer for a building. From an employee standpoint or apprentice standpoint, the benefit is great. So I will use my pigeon patrol analogy earlier. As a preservation technician, if I was in there and I found I was doing 500 hours of pigeon duty, but my apprenticeship schedule said I should only be spending 100 to 200 hours of my entire time period on general maintenance of that ilk. What I can do is, if I feel comfortable, go to the employer or go to the apprenticeship sponsor and say, I am not meeting the goals of this. I'm supposed to be learning all of these different competencies and I'm not getting that. They can help mitigate and mediate that, or put you with another apprenticeship provider to get those skills that you need. At the end, you get a certification with the Department of Labor. You become a journey level worker in that. And you also have coordinating pay raises. So, you know, after a year, you get a certain percentage increase based on the journey worker level raise. So the benefit of knowing all that in advance as somebody going in is there's a clear career path. There's clearly defined raises. It's way more equitable for people, especially people who are in a non-traditional career. And you have an idea and sense of where you're going. As a teacher, I always did that. I would give the questions before the reading, and so they would know what they were reading to. It's that type of idea. So there's a clear benefit for the apprentice. And from the employer standpoint, it's very similar. You know what you should be training on. You know what to expect of the apprentice too. And you have recourse if they're not meeting it. There's phases where you can pass them on to the next level. And if they're not meeting it, that's the way to, you know, end that relationship essentially. And then state by state, there's also benefits. So some states offer tax incentives, tax credits, subsidies even for wages. Maryland does that. And then subsidies for apprentices related instruction. So there's a lot of statewide benefits for it, but then even just internally, you have greater employee retention and happiness with the position because you're investing in those people and getting them a sense of ownership and training towards it. So what does this look like for deconstruction? As we're putting this together, you know, we are focused on the workforce development and the deconstruction. By grading it together, we're creating a job with it, and we're creating preservation standards for the training. We're going to put in what we want to see out of this as preservationists, rather than, you know, letting demolitionists go about and doing that and creating the standard. There is no demolition training right now, worth noting. So we've been working in close partnership with Repurposed Savannah on this design, and Savannah Technical College as well, to be one of the providers of the related instruction. We would have a deconstruction technician. It would come with an ONET code, median wages, and here's the description of what that would look like. Apprentices in this occupation would take anywhere from a year to 2,000 to 4,000, what they call on-the-job hours, as well as 180 to 360 hours of related instruction. This would include historic preservation fundamentals like documentation, research, building pathology, tool use and safety, hand and power tools, OSHA 30, lead safe RRP. As May mentioned, there's a lot of demolition that does not take into account all the hazardous materials that can be in a building. So this would be a very important step in mitigating that. Material science, material processing, understanding building systems, wood crafting, so how to repurpose those materials into new objects, and general project management. So from your standpoint, how do you get involved if you're interested? We have a newsletter if you want to keep up to date on that. But also what we really need to do is connect with employers. Like I said, this is a job-led, this is employer-led. So what we need is employers interested in hiring apprentices and getting that roster together and understanding if this meets everybody's needs and the standards for it. And then, as May said, we need some legislation to support it. If there's a market for deconstruction, there will be deconstruction training for sure. And there will be a need for it, and we can help define what that looks like as long as we get the advocacy or the legislation in place. You can also advocate in general for support for apprenticeships and training models. It's a much more equitable way of learning in general, rather than making people go into student debt, as I'm sure some people have personally experienced. So this is my information if anybody wants to email me directly. Like I said, otherwise we have a newsletter. And we also have a website. So thank you very much. I'm very excited for our Q&A session. And with that, I will pass it to Stephanie.
Thank you, Natalie. All right, hopefully everyone can hear me. Y'all might be able to see my really funky setup right now. We are about to brief a city commission on our proposed deconstruction policy, and there's our director, Shannon Miller, in the corner, because this is the widest angle ends possible that we set up in this conference room. So you're seeing deconstruction policy happening live behind the scenes. So thank you for bearing with us. But my name is Stephanie Phillips. I am the Deconstruction and Circular Economy Program Manager at the City of San Antonio Office of Historic Preservation. That is a lot of words, but that is a lot of important words. And I'm hoping that more people in the preservation field that have this title will be popping up more and more across the country. So I'm really excited to kind of round out the conversation and talk a little bit about deconstruction policy and what that might look like at the local level. So our office has been leading a deconstruction policy initiative since 2018. And I want to be sure to start off with the little quote at the top there. Like an organ donor, a structure may have reached the end of its life, but its parts and pieces could help extend the lives of dozens of other local structures. This analogy has really been the cornerstone of kind of how we are framing our entire policy initiative. Just the other day, we were briefing a city council committee, and one of the city council members asked, will a deconstruction policy result in more older historic buildings coming down? And one of our responses was, that is an inherent benefit of an Office of Historic Preservation leading this conversation, because first and foremost, our goal is to preserve the building, echoing things that May and Natalie said. But if that can't be done, and we know that can't always be done, it's really important that our profession, with our expertise and our value system and knowledge, are the ones leading these conversations, or at the very least having an active participatory role in how those policies are being developed, because if it's not us, it will be someone else. So the graphic that you see on the bottom kind of illustrates all of the other dimensions that we kind of communicate regularly with our stakeholders. A demolition economy versus a reuse economy. I think May really hit on this really well. It's not just about the building going to the landfill. It's not just about those environmental issues, even though those are critically important. It's also about the workforce. It's also about creating neighborhood networks of exchange, kind of anchoring our entire economy and that system on sharing resources instead of relying on new things to be constantly manufactured. And then, of course, the retention of cultural heritage and identity and local economic prosperity, just to name a lot of those examples. There's so many more, but this one here in particular focuses on that quote at the top. Something that's a goal and a priority of our policy initiative is that we're able to redirect materials that are typically headed to the landfill into the affordable housing repair of structures of a similar construction era. So as preservationists, we always say that we want things to be repaired in kind. There is very much a difference between an original wood window and a brand new manufactured wood window. And we really want those distinctions to be clear. And by having more of those reclaimed materials in our marketplace, the more they'll be available to repair our other buildings to avoid demolition in the first place. So again, how did we get here? Here are two different visualizations of kind of our demolition data trends in the past 10 years. So we started talking about deconstruction formally back in 2018 as a potential policy initiative. And as you can see, our demolition trends have only been going up. San Antonio right now is averaging about 500 demolitions a year, and honestly, we're trending closer to 600 at this point. That includes all building types, housing, commercial, even rear accessory structures like garages and carriage houses. And what's really important about this heat map on the left is that these outlines that you see are our historic districts and our neighborhood conservation districts. But these kind of concentrations of demolition, they may not have a historic district overlay or a conservation district overlay, but the housing stock and the building stock is largely of a similar construction era. San Antonio, like most American cities, developed radially. So just because they don't have that protection, just because they don't have that formal designation, does not mean that those buildings are worthy of being preserved or worthy of being deconstructed. So it's really important for us to tackle all of that building stock and just instead of just focusing on the stuff that may have the designations that we're used to. So some 4 key issues in San Antonio that I want to go over really quickly that are driving our initiative. So we were able to commission a report that I'm happy to share in the chat called Treasure in the Walls last year that gave us information on just the scale of demolition in San Antonio specifically. And one of the realizations was that we have thrown away at least $16 million worth of salvageable building materials in the last decade. And that amounts to just a lot, like hundreds of thousands of pounds of waste. And this is really critical because not only, again, is that environmental dimension, but this also demonstrates that we're throwing away money, right? Demolition is literally throwing away money. So we wanted to put a dollar figure to that and really demonstrate that we can recover that and reintroduce that into our communities and economy. I already mentioned this demolition statistic. It's really important to say because since 2012, we have seen at least a 68% increase in the amount of demolition requests in the city. So we need to tackle it now. May also hit on this so brilliantly. Demolition is air pollution, like plain and simple. And the trends that May had shown in Savannah about demolition disproportionately affecting intentionally or traditionally excluded populations, communities of color, people with less income is the same trend that we see in San Antonio. We actually started triangulating the same data that May used for our own studies. So this is really critically important. It is an equity issue. It is a public health issue. And with deconstruction, you see increased safe abatement, reduction of water usage, less GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really, really important. And the last thing I'll say on that is that San Antonio is really, really hot. It is just so hot here. We've had so many 100-degree days this summer, more than ever. And all of these air quality issues are only exacerbated by hotter days. And those days are going to be more frequent. So this is really, really important. And then, of course, something that we've noticed and is probably prevalent in a lot of communities across the country, just ask yourselves, how easily are reclaimed materials accessed in your community? And for us, we know that there is material exchange happening. We have pickers, we have architectural salvage, we have deconstruction contractors, but that exchange is through a limited array of stakeholders. It is not open to everyone equitably. So we want to tackle that issue as well. So all of those issues have manifested into our program priorities, and it's everything that I kind of hit on already. We really want to support affordable housing repair and production. We want to develop a local circular economy, starting with building materials. We want to increase our local pool of tradespeople and make renovation more cost competitive. Just like Natalie mentioned, we see deconstruction as a traditional heritage trade. Just like May said, that's how it used to be. We're going back to that. And then, of course, grow local industries in salvage, upcycling, and value-added manufacturing. Value-added manufacturing refers to someone taking a piece of lumber and making like furniture out of it, for example. But of course, above all of that, because we are a preservation organization and we are leading the charge, we want to make sure that those materials are recovered at their highest and best use and can be reused to repair other buildings. And of course, we always have to say this, I will say this, so everyone knows this initiative is not about if a building comes down, but rather how a building comes down. So we're not changing the way for buildings to be more readily approved for removal. May said it already, deconstruction is not a preservation alternative, it is a demolition alternative. So the way that our proposed deconstruction ordinance is written makes that very clear. And just like we always look at archival research, I really love this example from a San Antonio newspaper back in 1968. It references how a former post office building, granite columns were used to repair a structure on San Antonio's famous Riverwalk. And this amazing pun, granite new life. It's just so good. But it just further reinforces as we're communicating this concept that this is not a new thing. This is how we used to do things. And if you're on the Riverwalk, you can actually still see this facade today with those reclaimed columns from the 1890s. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I have to mention some other stuff that we've done as we've been working up to a deconstruction policy. We have kind of expanded our community engagement and outreach efforts. So these images are taken at a kind of a fair held by our Green Building Authority. It's called Solar Fest. It's held in our Civic Park downtown in San Antonio. And instead of using our booth to talk about all of the fun regulatory policy that we do, that everyone is so interested in, we were able to convert it into a creative upcycling activity for a family-friendly event. This was right around Thanksgiving, where we brought a bunch of reclaimed lumber and we cut them into ornament sizes and then used it as a booth where kids could create holiday ornaments. And the very best part of this activity, you see this like really gorgeous turkey lady over here. Her name is Sally. Our staff made her out of completely salvaged materials, including her eyeballs and her little beak. And we somehow convinced the mayor in front of actual human people to pardon her from the landfill. And his staff remembers it to this day. It is something that is like the best day of our work life. And it's, even though it was kind of like a public, publicity thing, the proclamation that he signed was very real. It talked about how we're diverting waste and, committing to climate heritage initiatives. So this is something that we've continued in different ways where we're using our ability to communicate, not only our initiative, but engage, new people in the process. We've talked a lot about workforce development. San Antonio too, we've had 2 deconstruction contractor trainings and another one is in the works. And it was really important for us before we proposed any legislation to City Council that we scaled up the workforce of people that could offer this service to our community. So here are images from those trainings. You can see all of this beautiful flooring, siding, shiplap being taken away. And the best thing is that this building was owned by the National Park Service, so we worked with them, and then this building was owned by our City Parks Service. So we were able to partner with those institutions to do those trainings, which I think makes a lot of sense. So this is the meat and potatoes of our proposed deconstruction ordinance. There's a lot of text here, so I'll go over it very quickly. But after 4 years of collaborative, intensive community engagement with a deconstruction advisory committee, we have a website that goes over all of this. I know this is a lot of stuff to cover quickly, but we are ready to bring a ordinance to council in early September. Yay, knocking on this laminate that everything goes well. But we're proposing an ordinance that will take effect in 3 phases. The first one would go into effect in October and would focus specifically on city executed demolitions, meaning if the city was initiating a demolition order, then that would convert to a deconstruction order for the building types that I'm about to describe in phase 2. So phase 2, we're looking at January 1 of next year. That would make deconstruction mandatory for residential single-family structures and up to a multi-unit structure that has 4 units or less, and accessory structures that were built before 1920 citywide, the whole city. And then if the property is located within a historic district or a neighborhood conservation district, that date goes up to 1945. And then phase 2, which would go into effect automatically 2 years later, the date citywide gets bigger to 1945. And then in historic districts and neighborhood conservation districts, that is bumped up to 1960. So we're really excited that we're at this point, and happy to answer any questions about that. Last but not least, in addition to the ordinance and all of the other things I've already mentioned, something that was really important for us to play a role in is answering the question that came up right away in 2018, where is all of the material going to go if we have 50, 100 more deconstructions happening in our city every year? And we're really happy to announce that we were able to enter into a relationship with Port San Antonio, which is a former Air Force base and now a technology innovation campus. They have this cluster of like more than 25 1920s beautiful bungalows and outbuildings, including this garage you see here. that were built originally to house the generals and the families that were at the base in the World War I, World War II eras. And we are using those spaces for a material innovation center, which we're calling the last stop before the landfill. And it's also one of the lab spaces for our Living Heritage Trades Academy. So we're really, really excited that we're able to take advantage of this really amazing partnership, bring these buildings back to life, and then also play an active role in how building materials are recovered and reused. And we anticipate that the materials that are donated to the center will be diverted for, again, affordable housing and repair projects that either the city does or our partners do. So that is my last slide. Oh, never mind. The last thing I want to mention is this particular graphic that you see on the right was also one of the first outcomes of our first Deconstruction Advisory Committee communications. One of our amazing advisory members, she mentioned, we're talking a lot about a bunch of different industries, right, that are affected just by how we decide to take a building down. Let's do a very simple mind map so we can show all of the ones together and how these are all interrelated. And this has really been kind of the thing that we go back to determine who should we partner with more. My absolute favorite part of this initiative has been the relationships that we have built with our solid waste department, with our sustainability community, with our public health community, with our workforce community. These are all things that we are actively partnering with because we're talking about this initiative. So from mapping connections to having conversations to forming partnerships that are enduring, we're in the room more consistently, and then of course to advancing our visions and goals and partnering on funding requests and really cool projects within the city. So this has opened up a whole new, level of partnerships that wouldn't have happened without us spearheading this and being open to kind of recognizing that the historic preservation field absolutely encompasses this topic. So with that, I will say thank you and open it up to our question and answer period.
Thank you, everybody, for your excellent presentations. Really wonderful to see all the work that's going on and all the energy that's happening here. We have some questions that are starting to pop up in our Q&A, so I just wanted to start going through some of them. So two questions we're asking about where deconstruction companies are located. They're sort of related. So first one for May is, do you only work in Georgia? And then someone also asked a related question about, for people in the northern part of the United States, are there any deconstruction companies that would be recommended? And May, before I let you answer, one of the things I was going to recommend is that people look at the buildreuse.org website, because there is a membership directory on that website, which is really helpful. But May, I'll let you go ahead and take that question then.
Sure. Yeah. So yes, deconstruction is happening all across the country. It's happening in other countries as well. Other countries sometimes are further along, sometimes they're just getting started, but definitely everywhere in North America, people are working in deconstruction, and we know all of them because it's still a pretty small community. And I would recommend everybody goes to Build Reuse as well. That's how I connected with so many people in this industry when I was first getting started, and that's buildreuse.org. They're an association of building material reuse experts. They work to advance the cause. And then the other question, do we work only in Georgia? So far, actually, no. We have done some work in South Carolina. Coastal Georgia, it's a real short coastline, so we're quite close to some other states here. Happy to travel, love to travel. Might be collaborating soon with Stephanie in San Antonio. That would be awesome. But we are certainly open to flying out and helping people. Lots of us are. A lot of people in this industry, if you can't find somebody hyper local to you, will travel to help you either get trained up so you guys can start your own local initiative, or just help you get your building down. If it's like a one-off project, we're here to help.
Great. And I'll just put a little plug in for our new crowd website. We do have a resource guide in our resource section. It's New York State specific, but if folks want to take a look at that, it's sort of in its infancy, but it is helpful if you were looking for some names and places within the state of New York to get going. So we have some other really good questions too in the Q&A. Do you have a rough estimate of the proportion of demolition waste avoided through deconstruction? Obviously, plaster and much roofing is not recyclable and presumably goes to a dump. So how, I guess they're wanting to know, how do you quantify that and what proportion do you have?
Yeah. We track data aggressively. I'm a real big nerd about this. So I like to know what we're doing. I like to know how much it's costing. I like to know how much we're saving. So on average, we save 75 to 95% of a building. And there are a lot of factors that go into that. Was it already gutted when we got it? Did we have drywall or plaster to deal with? You know, was the roof metal that could be reclaimed, or was it asphalt? So you're absolutely right. Plaster, roofing material, insulation, there are a lot of things that don't have excellent reuse potential. In our case, we're lucky. We have a building materials recycling facility here in town called Green Acres. So we send everything that we can't keep to them. And their statistics say that 3% of what they have come in the door ends up in the landfill. So if we're sending them 15% of the building, then 3% of that 15% might end up in the landfill. The rest will get recycled and the rest will get salvaged. We think that's pretty good compared to 100% landfilling.
Great. And a sort of related question further down in the Q&A relates this as well. They're asking about asbestos and lead paint, and how you deal with that, and then who's paying for the deconstruction. So
yes,
you could say a bit about that. That would be great.
Yes, I think we always need to talk about hazardous materials in this conversation. So every state has different regulation for demolition, but in Georgia, as Natalie mentioned, you don't have to be certified, licensed, or bonded to be a demolition provider. Our competition is really casual. They're informal. These are kind ways to say they cut corners. They don't practice good safety. They certainly aren't applying for demo permits. They're just crushing the building and hoping they get away with it. There's a lot of that goes on around here and probably in your town too. And that also means they are shirking the requirements associated with that permitting, which includes hazardous material inspection, testing, and abatement. Now, of course, I'm putting my crew of living humans, whom I'm adore, into these buildings to take them apart by hand. I'm not going to do that without having it professionally inspected. And if anything positive is found, it's going to be professionally abated. The cost of that is the responsibility of the homeowner. And that should be analogous to what's going on in the demo world. The only reason it isn't is because demolition gets away with so much murder. But that should be apples to apples. What was the next question? Sorry.
Let me just pull it up
Like
again.
there was another one.
Yeah. So who pays for it?
So let's talk about the way the money moves a little bit. So I'm a nonprofit. So essentially, when we were first getting started, you know, in order to get any jobs, we had to be apples to apples, toe to toe with demolition. We had to provide the same resulting service. We had to definitely match price or we would never get a job. We could not compete with timeline. You cannot deconstruct a building by hand as quickly as you can tear it down. So in order to convince people to let us do the same job slower, we had to match the price. Now that we've grown and we've made some industry connections through conferences like the Build Reuse Conference, we work with an appraisal company. So being a nonprofit, that allows us to offer a fairly sizable tax deduction to anybody who is essentially donating all of the materials in their building to us. That also means I can now raise the cost of my service to reflect our actual costs. And so I don't have to lose money every time. And I tell you, you know, competing with something that's fast, cheap, and easy and terrible for everybody is hard. What we're doing is great for everybody, but it's slow, hard, and expensive. And so it's really nice to be able to have the market coming to meet us. I'm really happy to be able to offer a tax deduction to our clients so that in the end of the day, they might even save money by comparison to just working with a demo company. But there should be costs associated with this service. A lot of people ask me if this is free because we're getting the materials out of it. It is not free. Labor is expensive. Insurance is expensive. We're trying to work above board. So in order to pull that off, we need to be paid for our service. Everybody should be paid for their labor in this world.
That's great. And then another question that was really interesting too, and I think maybe Stephanie, you could answer, is because people are asking about language. So what language should be included in a deconstruction ordinance to ensure that deconstruction is only used as a last resort? And whether you want to attach this to discussions about what exists in an existing preservation ordinance or CLG language, feel free to expand.
Sure. And I might have to leave abruptly. We're about to brief a board, like I mentioned. So, but I'll try to tackle this, and I'll let our amazing other panelists do this as well. It definitely depends on your jurisdiction. One thing that we know to be true is that deconstruction policy is not copy paste. It shouldn't be copy paste. It should be unique to your own local and state jurisdiction. But what we have found is that, this is also a conversation around your preservation ordinance, right? So if there is a weak preservation ordinance, that's going to affect how things come down. So also look at that. But for us, we have slowly been introducing things into our landmarks commission review, where we add a stipulation where salvage should be encouraged. So there are really creative ways to kind of start adding this in, even before going for a full-fledged policy like we are. But that's a complicated question, and I'm sure we can have another whole session on that.
That's very true. I don't know, Natalie, if you want to expand on that or add anything to that.
I don't have too much on the advocacy side. Luckily, Preservation Maryland has a good advocacy department, so they help me out on a lot of those fronts. But yeah, I think what Stephanie said about it being localized, at least on the apprenticeship end, a lot of it is with state departments labor, so it looks very different. So yeah, how do you work with your local areas and getting those regulations in place?
Yeah, and there was a question too from another attendee who asked about examples of governments that have put in place good and working policies or legislations to look at and share. And so, as Stephanie said, there are a lot of local conditions that come into play, but I would encourage people, once it's on their website, to look at the city of San Antonio's document and to look at other cities.
It's live. It's live.
It's live. Okay, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, look at it live. And also look at places like Portland and Palo Alto and other communities that are starting to put these policies into place. That would be a good location. We have a nice question. How can a young professional already out of school get preservation trades training? A lot of programs are aimed towards enrolled students or new graduates. So I'm really excited to hear from Natalie about your work, because this, I think, fits right in. A lot of people are very curious and would like to learn how to do these things hands-on.
Right. Yes. And it is, there's a multitude of things around that. So one of the reasons a lot of programs are geared at that is the funding streams. A lot of them are youth programs or contingently tied to enrollment in an accredited program. There's a multitude of reasons for all of that, but right now that's where a lot of government funding is, and just the predilection for college degrees in general as a means to a career path. So we don't necessarily want that youth programming to go away. It is good, but what we need in addition is career transitioning. There's a lot of people in their 30s who are interested, who are automatically excluded, or I myself went back to school. I went and got my AAS after getting my graduate degree. And so I was not eligible for any type of student aid for that. So I had to pay out of pocket, and I made it work, but it would have been nice if it didn't, if I could have gotten a student loan even. So there's definitely some bigger problematic things, but one of the ways we're tackling that is through this apprenticeship. So the idea is that on the apprenticeship, you would get that training and be paid at the same time. So you wouldn't have to go out and find a training program, leave where your area to do it. That's what May is working on with her crew. Those are apprenticeships models. They're on the job, they're learning, they're getting paid, and we're trying to tie that in with Savannah Tech and try and find ways to get that tuition paid for. So you don't necessarily need to be degree seeking to do that, but there is a required related instruction. In addition, we're trying to work on some other moderate training programs. I think somebody mentioned some cross training, like we'd love to start getting what we call preservation literacy classes to general construction. So how can we work with, remodeling crews on what decon is? So even if they're taking out the windows, window person, it hurts, but if they're taking them out, let's not put that in the landfill. Let's give them to May. Like, how do you do that without destroying the window? Because sometimes they've literally just taken apart the sashes into components. It's like, okay, you didn't have to go that far. Could have, just kept the sash and kept it to us. So we want to work on the depth and the breadth of it too. But that's where we're going, at least on the preservation trades training. I'd recommend starting to look into these apprenticeships we're developing, working with employers, and we can provide some of the related instruction to that.
So for all of you, or whoever wants to respond to this, are there some good materials that are available right now on any websites that you think can be helpful for educating local small contractors and, you know, really convincing them of the value of reuse, recycling, you know, deconstruction?
Sure. I know Build Reuse has put out sort of the book. If anybody's written a book on deconstruction, it's that organization. So I have a copy. I look at it sometimes. Recommend reading it. Materials are constantly evolving, though. I'm working on some right now. I'd love to share with you all. Give me some time. But maybe starting with this association is probably the best place. And then from there, when you get into the directory and maybe start networking and meeting people who are in the industry, you can start to connect to some of the resources that they've developed as well. So this is a super grassroots, like emerging industry. And so a lot of the resources are a little bit disparate and spread out, but that's okay. I encourage you to start aggregating it. You pick it up pretty quickly.
Great. Yeah, and one of the questions I think always comes up, and I can see it here in the Q&A, about the cost comparison between deconstruction and standard demolition. And we've been talking a lot about gathering data and numbers. So do you have anything, at least locally in your communities, where you can compare that? I imagine there's probably some stuff on the Build Reuse website as well.
Yeah, I love to talk about numbers. Like I said, I'm a big nerd about the numbers. I think that's the only way that we prove it's working. So cost comparison. So the biggest factor in comparing the cost of your service to the cost of demolition is, what are your tipping fees in your community? Georgia is one of the cheapest states in the nation for landfilling. Who's surprised? It's very affordable to chuck it all away here. So that's a major challenge for us. And if I had infinite capacity, you better believe I would also be out in the public speaking on increasing the cost of landfilling, regulating demolition, enforcing permitting. All these things would drive the cost of demolition up in my community. But as a rule, it's pretty affordable. Like I said, fast, cheap, and easy. So it's still going to cost you a lot of money to finish a building. And other factors when it comes to pricing demolition are, what are the contexts? Do you have a giant open field around your building, or do you have another historic building 3 feet away from your western wall? So in more dense areas, the cost of demolition goes way up because, and of course, when they're crushing everything, like, their liability is really high. You know, they could very easily cause damage to other buildings, and that's when they're going to get in trouble. So all those factors aside, costing for deconstruction is about labor. It's not about tipping. We don't pay hardly anything in tipping fees. We usually get away with a whole 2-story building, maybe 1 30-yard dumpster. Maybe we had to get a second 10-yard for the leftovers. I mean, we rarely put more than a single dumpster from a house into the landfill. It's a marginal amount of the cost. The bigger part is learning and getting good at estimating how much time it's going to take and how much labor it's going to take and what equipment you need and things like that. So I have gotten a lot better at this over the course of the last 4 years, and I am able to pull off a price match for demolition, especially in the dense area where that cost is a lot higher. That helps me, but I don't want to, because then I'm only breaking even. I'm not making a margin. And like I said, this is a really tough business. So I work particularly to find other advantages for people who are seeking this service to help incentivize them to work with us so that I can keep the cost of that up, because I got a lot of mouths to feed. You know, I got a lot of women to pay. They deserve to be paid more than they are right now. I'm actively working on increasing the viability of this in my local community, in my local economy, value add, create a reputation so that we can demand a higher rate and pay our people better and increase quality of life and really create an industry that reflects the level of, how do I say this? The level of profitability that you see in the construction industry. I mean, construction is a good business to be in. It's part of the reason we're so aggressively training women to get jobs in that industry, because they're very well paid. It's a great career, especially if you can't sit at a desk all day. And that's a lot of people. So our profit margins should be more analogous to those instead of this like scrappy lifestyle we lead where we're barely making it. We're making it, guys. Like, we're growing a lot, but it's hard to compete with such a slim, unregulated industry. I hope that helps answer the question a little bit. So yeah, the cost question is dense. Anybody wants to talk to me about it offline, send me an email.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. And it sort of relates to something that was suggested in one of the Q&A. You were talking about the construction industry, and somebody was asking about kind of blowback, from the construction industry, or, what sort of resistance do you face from traditional contractors about this whole process, and developers too, who, want to get their projects up and running quickly. So if either one of you, or Stephanie, if she's available, want to elaborate on that, that would be great.
Sure. It looks like Stephanie ran away, so I'll cover for her for a second while she's doing the Lord's work. So there's two real approaches to trying to advance the cause of deconstruction in your community. There's the carrot and there's the stick, right? And we have found, I think, as a collective over the course of trying this for a while and succeeding in some places and failing in other places, that it's really great to start with the carrot. That's what we've done in Savannah. I have built a lot of relationships with people in this industry. I work with all the contractors. I work with other demo contractors. I work with the developers. I have to say, I do deals with the devil. I have to deal with a lot of people who are tearing down historic buildings because they want to. I don't like that. But if I don't work with them, it's going to go to the dump. They get away with it and it goes to the dump. So, I lost my thread. Help me, Christine.
So just the blowback, or just pushback from traditional contractors or developers who want to get their projects going quickly.
Thank you. So everybody who's already interfaced with us kind of totally supports what we do because I'm saving them money. So if they're already ripping materials out and they're putting them in a dumpster and they're paying money to throw that in the landfill, and I tell them, well, you can just put it neatly on stickers next to your dumpster and we'll come and pick it up for free, right? They love that because it's like a streamlining and it's helping them save money. So we've created a lot of goodwill leading up to this effort at policy, and now we're starting to feel some blowback. So now we're coming in with the stick and trying to say, this is not only a benefit to you, it is also a requirement for you. They love that less, but it's not nearly as aggressive as I think it would have been if we hadn't created sort of a fertile community consciousness toward this. And Stephanie would echo this as well. She has put an enormous amount of work into building community education, awareness raising, and building a demand for a service that doesn't even exist in their community yet, because she's done such a good job working with everybody to create synergies, possibilities, economic opportunities. For example, cross-training existing contractors to provide this as a value add rather than stealing their business, right? Which is something I do. Not on purpose, but I'm just trying to save the buildings. So our pushback is mostly along the lines of when we're telling people that they have to use our service versus something that they're used to. And the difference also is because timeline is longer. So I work in major construction projects. I work in basically at site prep for what are pretty enormous new build projects, and you don't want to delay them. But I also know, and I have learned, and anybody who's in construction and demolition will tell you, there is a lot of hurry up and wait in construction. There is a lot of waiting and permitting, especially in a historic district when you're having to get review board oversight, right? And our review boards here in Savannah are the ones that are creating conditional approvals on using deconstruction service for any necessary demolition, right? Which is awesome. And I sit on one of those commissions, so I get to do that. But I lost my thread again. I'm so bad about this. If we plan ahead and if we start thinking about deconstruction as the normal, as your only option, right? All that time of waiting can be used in your deconstruction phase. There's almost always more than enough time. More often than not, when I'm scheduling, I'm told that this is the hard deadline. So I'm like, great, we got to get started 2 months out, or we got to get started a month out. And by the time I'm done, they're not ready. That's usually the way. I mean, everybody who's ever built a house knows it doesn't go according to schedule. So it is not true that there's no time in the arc to make space for deconstruction. Of course there is. We just got to get contractors used to it. And if it's what they're used to and it's what they expect, then they plan ahead and nothing is delayed. So I do think there's work there with just hearts and minds. And if the cost of demolition is increasing, it is helping them understand that it's time to think about planning ahead and working with this alternative.
Great. I mean, that's a great answer. And I think it also touches on the kind of workforce questions too, like that Natalie is working on. And Natalie, I wonder if you could talk a little about within the historic trades and within building trades generally, if you are hearing, even if it's like anecdotally about a demand for this type of workforce and the skilled labor that is required to do the work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's hard for me to say because I know a lot of people, but I don't know if that is representative of the whole field in general. And I would like a better picture of it, which is one of my calls to action for everybody out there if they know people and employers who are interested in it. And I think that it's one of those that people do without realizing it, like the partial deconstructions. That happens all the time. And I think that I was talking to somebody who's working in the Department of Transportation, and a lot of that has to do with rights of way and building out new areas. But what happens is the demolition of historic structures along the way. And so we are talking about how about we make a training youth corps in deconstruction rather than just demoing those buildings. And the Department of Transportation is huge. So I think to May's point about having some of these conversations proactively and how it can engage and work within the systems already, I think that is a way to help encourage it. Because when we brought it up, it wasn't an idea that they had thought of, but they were very receptive to. They understood that could be a possibility. And it, again, as that alternative to demolition, it would be so much greater to have those historic resources and reuse them and also use it as training for people. So I'm not as sure on the private market side, but I think there is a need on the public side. I think was it the Johnny Mercer House that was part of DNR and they didn't have the resource to save the building?
It was state of Georgia who tore that building down. Or
yeah. Yes. And it's a constant problem where a lot of these buildings and historic resources are given to public land agencies that don't have the money or resources to care for it. They have hundreds of buildings that just sit there because there's literally nobody to work on it. So not saying we should all take them down, but what they do is demolition by neglect very often. So if that can be an alternative to demolition by neglect, we create a workforce. And if we can do that simultaneous with creating the private industry through regulations and making demolition cost what it actually should cost, then we have this private market to meet the training need as well. So it's a hand in hand. Personally, I see the market, but yes, I live in a bubble where deconstruction is okay and talked about.
No, it makes sense. There's a lot of things that go together hand in hand. There was a question here in the Q&A where somebody was asking, I guess I saw the picture of the College Ave buildings in Ithaca. They were asking if it was it time or available workforce limitations or something else that meant Historic Ithaca Significant Elements was only able to deconstruct one of the half dozen buildings. So I'll just put a correction in there. So the project was actually headed up by Finger Lakes Reuse and the Circular Construction Lab through a special grant through Cornell to work on one of the set of houses that was coming down. So, I don't want to speak for Diane Cohen and Felix Heisel, but, part of the difficulty was timing, getting a skilled person who does deconstruction to use it as a demonstration project to sort of show the union workers how it works. So it was a number of factors. It wasn't just one thing, I guess I'll say. But this is definitely an issue, is making sure that you do have the skilled workforce. And this is why, Natalie's work with the Historic Trades program is so essential. And what May is doing, it really is going to help change the game and provide some very concrete reference points for people to move forward and actually use as a guide to go forward. So that'll be really important, especially once people see what is possible and how this can be done. So I know we're getting to, I think it's 1:24 right now. So I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add in, Natalie and May, before we take any other questions or anything that we sort of skipped over that you're maybe burning to say.
Yeah, I had a comment really just off of what you were just saying. And I will say that I do think that the biggest challenge about developing this industry as a standard practice is that there's so much that needs to be developed at the same time. So it's this very spread out effort. And, I think all the time about how the rising tide lifts all boats. And that is what this feels like, is developing this industry. Is a slow, but very lateral, like elevating of this concept, because you can't just have a service provider, right? In a vacuum. You also have to have the reuse retail outlet, right? Or the materials are just going to sit in big piles that are naily. I always say, because I'm trying to motivate my crew to denail faster, if it sits here like this, it's just another kind of landfill, right? If we don't get it processed and back out into the community, what are we even doing? So I'd love to be partnering with another business on that, like you see in some other cities, but I can't because there isn't anybody. So we have to be both. And I have to work on advocacy for policy here because we don't have an Office of Historic Preservation or a Stephanie in Savannah. So, we could be running a lot faster if we didn't have to be all the things, which is why I really encourage everybody to start networking. Like, get to know anybody in your community who's already working on this, get involved, connect with each other. Stephanie said that the most rewarding part of this was the relationships that she built. 100% true for me as well. I got into this because I'm passionate about conservation and old things, but I'm sticking around because I've built an entire family around this, and our community has really risen up around this concept. And we built partnerships with so many local businesses, and it really feels like a hyper local circular economy. The thing you read about in books is developing in our community. So I just wanted to indicate that everybody has a role to play in this. If you don't feel like you can take a building apart with a crowbar, cool. There's lots of work to do. There's research, there's policy, there's business, getting involved with the business community. We need all types. Everybody get involved.
That's a good point. Yeah, and the relationships thing is really important. I mean, that crowd works collaboratively because there's no way, Historic Ithaca as a preservation organization can do this on its own. There's absolutely no way. So I'll put a little plug in for the Build Reuse conference, which is virtual. It's coming up in mid-October. So, for those of you out there who are getting interested and want to learn more, do more, find out more, I recommend signing up for that virtual conference, because that's where you're going to start to hear about what people are doing across the country and learn about what's happening. And it's tremendously helpful. And I know, May has been a part of it and knows a lot of the benefits there. So I would definitely encourage people to do that. And Natalie, do you have any recommendations for other places for people to learn more? Conferences, whether they're virtual or websites?
Yes. I definitely link somebody to the Build Reuse website and the resources there. I think that is great. I think what we're working on with the campaign is a new website that is going to be very resource driven and person driven. So you can go on and find resources for where you're at and what you need, including continuing education, mid-tier professional, advocate. So any type of resource that people know about, we really want to have a conglomerate of that so we can direct people to the right locations. So I guess I'm plugging ourselves for that, but we do want to just be a conglomerate of all those resources. Additionally, we'll have some of the online curriculum that can be used for some of that cross-training of existing professionals in these resources. So it seems like there is a demand for that, and people who are interested and connect with those. I would say 2023 is probably our goal for that. So stay tuned for that. And then also just Repurposed Savannah has a very great Instagram. Lots of great pictures and processes that you can follow along. It's not necessarily a how-to, but yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, we're not shy. I'm not proprietary. Follow us, learn how to do this, and start doing it in your community too.
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting point to bring up too. There's a lot of conversation, especially with the new federal bill that was signed, about sustainable practices within communities. So, if you are wondering what your own municipality is doing in terms of any sort of Green New Deal, this is definitely a question to bring to your building division or planning department to ask, so what is the policy like on demolition, or how is it tracked? And could you suggest deconstruction instead? I mean, this is where you start asking questions. You'll start to see the magnitude of the problem, but also the world of possibility out there.
Yes.
And so, I think people should, if they're, within their own communities, to find out, what exactly is the local government doing or the county government doing, to help the situation. Yeah.
Oh, and I thought I'd mention one of the cool new programs that we've got going here in Savannah is that we're working, well, after some really tragic demolitions happened of cherished and meaningful buildings recently. Even in the city of Savannah, guys, this happens where preservation is king. And there was a lot of public upset about it, including myself. You better believe I got a lot of phone calls that day. And as a result, the city has put together a program which now does require any demolition of a building, regardless of whether it's in a local historic district. And of course, the ones that we lost were not. We wish they were all protected by overlays, but they are not. Even if they're not in the district, you still have to document the building before you can tear it down, and you have to submit that for review and approval to the municipal archive. So that's a local program we've developed, which at the very least means that we're getting records of these things before they're being lost, submitted to the archive. So that's actually been a value add for my business, because I can tell people I work with the archives all the time. We make these donations regularly. I'll handle it for you. We'll make sure you comply. You won't be delayed. We're going to document this building. Like I said, we scan them, we do drawings, we heavily photograph, and we take videos of our process and submit all of that to the city. And it's become a growing resource that we wish we'd had for years for what was there before. And that is preservation, even in the face of structural loss, which we all hate.
No, the recordation is really important. I think that's a very important point that you've raised. So I know Katie's back on screen. I know we're at 1:30, but I just wanted to sort of thank you all again. This has been excellent. And also to say, I mean, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions if people want to email me at Historic Ithaca. And I think Stephanie, May, and Natalie are also very generous and would be willing to do that as well.
Definitely. Also,
Yeah,
May, are you
absolutely.
hiring? Kelsey is wondering.
Am I hiring?
Yep.
I wish I was hiring. I have a wait list. People will tell you, I'll be quick. People will tell you that there is a labor crisis in construction and demolition, and it's not true. Hire women. Women want jobs. I wish I could hire you as well. Maybe if we get a big grant or some benefactor, here's one of my presentations and wants to donate a lot of money. I'm talking to you. Then I can hire you. So thanks for asking.
Awesome. Well, I think this is a good place to end it. We're at time. But thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you, Natalie, May, Christine, and Stephanie. Hope she's having a good presentation right now. Yeah, as she said, it's happening in real time here. But this was great. This was a great conversation. You all are doing really incredible work. And I think this topic in particular really drives home to me how collaborative preservation can be, how intersectional it can be, because it really does touch on all of these disparate things that people don't necessarily think of together, but it's important that we think of it more holistically and find those partnerships and people to interact with and really make this part of the more normal conversation so that we can all work together to build a better world, because that's what we want at the end of the day, right? So thank you all for your time, and thank you for tuning in. Like I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar was recorded. If you loved it and want to share it with your friends, please do. You can find it on our YouTube channel, on Facebook, and I will have a recap up on our blog shortly that'll have some links to things that we talked about and some other resources. So you can find that on the preservenys.org website in a few days. And I hope that you all join us for another presentation at some point soon. We do webinars like this fairly regularly. Our next one is on disability justice and preservation on September 27th, so I hope that you can tune in for that. I also want to give a plug for the New York Statewide Preservation Conference, which is in person again for the first time in a couple of years. So if you are in New York or close to New York, or just feel like being in Syracuse for a few days, we will be there from September 21st to the 24th, and we would love to see you there. And as everyone mentioned, the Build Reuse Conference is also virtual in October, so you can look out for that. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this, got something out of it. Feel free to reach out to any of us, and we'd love to talk to you about deconstruction or anything else preservation related. And I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.